Picture this: a fragile, yellowed page, tucked away in a forgotten corner of a medieval cookbook for nearly 800 years. Its ink is faded, its edges crumbling, but the words scrawled across it hold a secret so explosive, it shatters our entire understanding of what people ate in the Middle Ages. This isn't just another recipe for pottage or roasted meat. No, this single page is a culinary bombshell, revealing ingredients you'd never expect in a medieval kitchen, spices from halfway across the world, techniques borrowed from distant cultures, even flavors that vanished from history entirely. And the most astonishing part, this humble scrap of parchment proves that medieval cuisine was far more sophisticated, interconnected, and downright adventurous than we ever imagined. Think about the last time you savored a dish that surprised you. Maybe it was a spice you'd never tasted before, or a method of cooking that felt completely new. Now imagine that same sense of discovery, but multiplied across centuries of lost knowledge. That's what this page represents. It's not just a list of ingredients. It's a snapshot of a world where trade routes stretched farther than we knew, where cooks experimented boldly, and where flavors we consider modern were already being enjoyed in castles and cottages alike. And here's the kicker. This discovery doesn't just rewrite the history of food, it rewrites the history of us, because what we eat tells the story of who we are, where we've been, and how we've connected across oceans and empires. So how did this page stay hidden for so long, and why does it matter now? Over the next few minutes, we're going to unravel the secrets buried in those ancient lines of text. We'll meet the scholars who decoded its mysteries, taste the long-lost flavors it brings back to life, and trace the incredible journeys of ingredients that crossed continents before Columbus even set sail. This isn't just a story about food, it's a story about human curiosity, ingenuity, and the timeless desire to explore, even within the walls of a kitchen. So grab a seat at the table, because history is about to get a lot more delicious. The historian working in that dim archive wasn't even searching for culinary secrets. They were studying trade routes when an odd phrase in the margin of a ledger caught their attention. Take grains of paradise and saffron. It read, scrawled in faded brown ink. That alone was strange. Saffron was rare and costly, but grains of paradise. That spice came from West Africa, a place most medieval Europeans had never even heard of, and yet here it was, casually listed alongside rosemary and thyme as if it were a pantry staple. The page wasn't just a recipe, it was a map of hidden connections, proof that ingredients traveled thousands of miles before the age of globalization. As the scholar carefully turned the fragile parchment, more surprises emerged. The instructions called for pounding almonds into a creamy paste centuries before modern chefs rediscovered almond milk as a dairy alternative. There were citrus fruits preserved in honey from regions far beyond medieval Europe's borders, and the most baffling detail, a technique for slow cooking meat in sealed clay pots, a method strikingly similar to dishes still made in North Africa today. This wasn't just a recipe, it was a culinary time capsule, revealing flavors and techniques that defied everything historians thought they knew about medieval cooking. What made this discovery so explosive wasn't just the exotic ingredients, it was the context. This cookbook wasn't written for royalty or wealthy merchants. The handwriting was hurried, the ink smudged in places, suggesting it was used in a bustling monastery kitchen or a modest noble household. That meant these flavors weren't just for the elite, they'd trickled down into everyday cooking. Suddenly, the Middle Ages didn't seem so monochrome or monotonous. This page painted a picture of a world where a humble cook might toast cumin from India, stir in dried apricots from Persia, and finish a dish with a pinch of something unreadable, a spice lost to time. And that's the real mystery, because tucked between the lines were words no one could fully translate, ingredients or techniques scribbled in a shorthand only the original cook would have understood. Was it a local herb that's since vanished, a secret trick for tenderizing meat? Every faded letter held a question, but one thing was certain: this page wasn't an anomaly. It was a clue, a single thread in a much larger tapestry of flavors that once crisscrossed continents long before we assumed such connections existed. The recipe scrawled across that ancient page reads like a love letter to a forgotten world of flavor. At first glance, it seems simple, a stew of sorts with meat and vegetables, but the devil's in the details. The instructions call for saffron, that golden spice worth its weight in gold, mingling with ginger from the east and something even more surprising: dried citrus peel, possibly from Seville oranges grown in Moorish Spain. These weren't just random additions, they were carefully balanced, layered with the precision of a perfumer. And the method: the meat was to be marinated overnight in wine and crushed herbs, then slow braised in a sealed pot with vinegar and honey, a technique that wouldn't become common in European kitchens for another 300 years. What's truly revelatory isn't just the ingredients or the methods, but what they imply about the people behind them. This wasn't some royal decree from a king's kitchen. The handwriting is practical, hurried notes from someone who cooked this dish regularly, not as a grand spectacle, but as part of daily life. The recipe even includes substitutions. If saffron be wanting, use turmeric, it suggests, proving this wasn't just for the ultra-wealthy. Someone, perhaps a monastery cook or a minor noble chef, had access to these global flavors and the skill to wield them. And that's where history gets turned on its head. We've long imagined medieval food as bland, monotonous peasants chewing on stale bread while lords feasted on roasted meats. But this page tells a different story. It reveals a world where a humble kitchen might smell of cumin and coriander, where citrus zest brightened winter stews, where techniques from Baghdad or Damascus found their way into European pots. The real question isn't just what were they eating, but how did they know? Because every pinch of spice in that recipe is a breadcrumb trail, evidence of trade networks stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, of cooks swapping secrets across language barriers, of flavors migrating long before borders hardened. Then there's the social puzzle. The dish isn't labeled as exotic or foreign. It's written matter of factly, as if these ingredients were as ordinary as salt. That suggests something radical. These flavors weren't novelties but familiar comforts. Maybe a crusader brought back spices as souvenirs, or a merchant's wife traded recipes with a visiting diplomat. Whatever the path, this single page proves that medieval Europe wasn't a culinary backwater. It was a crossroads where a pot simmering over a fire could hold the taste of continents. But here's the twist that keeps historians up at night. Buried in the margins are stains, grease, wine, maybe even fingerprints, hinting that this page wasn't just read but used. Someone once stood in a smoky kitchen, following these very instructions, blending flavors that would shock a modern food critic with their sophistication. And that's the real magic, because history isn't just written in treaties and battles sometimes. It's scribbled in the margins of a cookbook, waiting 8 centuries for us to taste it anew. For centuries, historians painted medieval European cuisine with broad, unappetizing strokes. Gray slabs of salted meat, stale bread, and flavorless pottage, all barely seasoned with local herbs. The common narrative insisted that before the age of exploration, European palates were isolated. their kitchens limited to whatever grew within a few miles of home. Spices, if they appeared at all, were reserved for the ultra-wealthy, used more as status symbols than ingredients. Preservation methods like smoking and salting supposedly dominated, leaving little room for creativity or refinement. But here's the problem with that assumption. It was based mostly on guesswork, fragments of elite banquet records, and a heavy dose of modern bias. The truth, as this cookbook page reveals, was far more vibrant. Yes, scarcity existed, bad harvests and harsh winters were real, but that didn't stop flavors from traveling. Take pepper, for example. We've long known it reached Europe via ancient Roman trade, but this recipe includes something far rarer: long pepper, a spicier cousin from India that was thought to have vanished from European kitchens by the Middle Ages. Yet here it is, ground into a sauce alongside everyday ingredients like onions and garlic. Even more telling, the recipe doesn't treat it as a luxury. It's just another flavor in the mix, suggesting these spices weren't locked away in some noble's treasury. They were in active use, even in modest kitchens. Then there's the myth of monotony. Modern reconstructions of medieval meals often focus on repetitive staples like barley, turnips, and cabbage. But this page lists no fewer than 7 herbs in one dish alone, some familiar like parsley and sage, others more obscure like the now-forgotten rosemary, a mint-like leaf once prized for its citrusy tang. Even preservation wasn't as crude as we imagined. The cookbook describes fruits preserved not just in honey or brine, but in spiced syrups, their flavors layered with cinnamon and cloves. These weren't just survival foods, they were deliberate creations meant to delight the tongue even in the dead of winter. So how did these ingredients defy geography? The answer lies in networks we've underestimated for too long. Islamic Spain was a gateway where Arab traders introduced saffron and citrus to Europe. Crusaders didn't just bring back loot, they brought back tastes, stuffing their saddlebags with apricots from Damascus or nutmeg from far-off ports. Jewish merchants, often fluent in multiple languages, acted as culinary bridges, moving spices along routes that bypassed political borders. And monasteries, they weren't just spiritual centers, they were hubs of agricultural experimentation, where monks traded seeds and recipes with travelers from as far away as China. The real shock isn't that these flavors reached Europe, it's how deeply they were woven into daily life. This cookbook page doesn't read like a novelty, it reads like someone's Tuesday dinner. And that changes everything, because if a single manuscript from a quiet corner of England could hold such cosmopolitan flavors, how many other recipes, how many other stories have we missed? Suddenly, the medieval world feels smaller, more connected, and far more delicious than we ever dared to imagine. The spices in that medieval recipe tell a story far bigger than flavor. They reveal a web of trade routes humming with activity centuries before Columbus sailed. Venice wasn't just a city of canals, it was a spice superhighway where merchants haggled over sacks of saffron from Persia and ginger from the Malabar coast. But here's what historians missed. These ingredients didn't just gather dust in some duke's treasury. They trickled down through markets, monasteries, and even mid-level kitchens, transforming everyday cooking in ways we never anticipated. Take ginger, for example. Most assume it was a rare luxury, but this cookbook treats it like kitchen basics, grating it into stews as casually as we'd use black pepper. And saffron, its threads appear in a sauce meant for ordinary fish, not some royal feast. That's the bombshell. These weren't just status symbols. They were practical tools used by cooks who understood their power to preserve meat, aid digestion, or even mask the taste of slightly off ingredients in lean winters. Spices weren't frivolous, they were the medieval equivalent of a well-stocked pantry, blending utility with artistry. The real mystery isn't how spices reached Europe, it's how they became normalized. The answer lies in the bustling kitchens of medieval courts, where chefs were the original fusion artists. Picture a cook in 14th century Paris, scribbling notes in the margin of a recipe. Add cubebs if available, else grains of paradise. Cubebs, a peppery berry from Java, weren't exotic oddities to this chef, they were options, like choosing thyme over rosemary. And that shift from rare to routine happened because royal kitchens became laboratories. When a king married a foreign princess, her chefs brought new flavors. When diplomats traveled, they traded recipes like state secrets. But the most surprising twist: spices didn't just flow inward. European cooks adapted them with local twists, creating dishes that would baffle their original creators. That ginger in the recipe. It might have been paired with barley, a grain Arabs considered animal feed, or stirred into ale instead of wine. This wasn't imitation, it was reinvention, proof that medieval kitchens weren't passive recipients of global trade. They were active participants, remixing flavors with a creativity we've only just begun to appreciate, and that's why this fragile cookbook page matters. It's not just a list of ingredients, it's a snapshot of a world in conversation, where a humble chef in England could wield flavors from 3 continents without a second thought. The real age of exploration didn't start with ships. It started with a wooden spoon and a curious cook, willing to taste the unfamiliar and make it their own. Royal kitchens weren't just places to feed the nobility. They were the Silicon Valley of medieval cuisine, where innovation happened at a dizzying pace. Picture a bustling hall in 15th century London, where a chef from Normandy might argue over the perfect consistency of a sauce with a spice merchant from Alexandria, while a pastry cook from Moorish Spain demonstrates how to layer honey and crushed nuts into delicate pastries. These weren't just employees, they were culinary diplomats, each carrying flavors and techniques from their homelands, blending them into something entirely new. And the dish in that rediscovered cookbook, it's the smoking gun, proof that these collaborations weren't just theoretical. The recipe's use of slow-cooked meat with saffron and citrus mirrors a technique found in Persian cooking, yet the addition of ale instead of wine is unmistakably Northern European. This wasn't fusion food, it was alchemy, but here's the twist: royal kitchens didn't hoard these innovations. Like today's trending recipes, they trickled outward. When a noble chef retired, he might open a tavern, bringing those sophisticated flavors to a broader audience. Apprentices trained in palace kitchens would carry skills to smaller towns, adapting dishes to local ingredients. Even monasteries played a role. Their scribes copied recipes, spreading them across regions like medieval food bloggers. That cookbook page might have originated in a castle, but its stains and scribbles suggest it was used far beyond those walls. So did commoners taste these global flavors? The evidence says yes, but with a catch. While peasants weren't sprinkling saffron on their porridge, they weren't entirely excluded from this culinary revolution. Market records show surprising details: bundles of pepper dust, the leftover crumbs from spice sacks sold cheaply to flavor the stews of craftsmen. Herbal gardens in villages grew poor man's saffron, marigold petals as a substitute. And when festivals or weddings rolled around, even humble households might splurge on a pinch of cinnamon or ginger, proof that these flavors weren't just for the elite. They were aspirational, tiny luxuries that connected people to a wider world. The real magic lies in how these exchanges reshaped regional cuisines. That recipe's use of vinegar and honey, it echoes German Sauerbraten, but the spices suggest Arab influence. The almonds pounded into paste, a technique from Baghdad repurposed in a French sauce. What we're seeing isn't just a dish, it's a conversation, one that crossed borders long before passports existed. And that's the ultimate lesson of this fragile page. Innovation has always been a team sport, with flavors as the common language. That handwritten cookbook page didn't just survive by chance, it slipped through the cracks of history because someone, somewhere, cared enough to copy it. And that act of copying reveals one of medieval Europe's best-kept secrets. Knowledge moved faster than we thought. Monasteries weren't just quiet retreats for prayer. They were medieval copy centers where monks meticulously reproduced everything from religious texts to recipes. Picture a Benedictine scribe hunched over a wooden desk, pausing mid-sentence to blot ink from his quill. The text he's copying isn't a psalm or a sermon, but instructions for braising venison with cloves and cinnamon. That's how elite dishes escaped palace walls, not through grand decrees, but through the quiet labor of ink-stained fingers. But manuscripts weren't the only way flavors traveled. Consider the medieval equivalent of a food truck, traveling chefs hired for weddings or festivals, carrying spice pouches and memory-stuffed notebooks. A cook who'd worked in a duke's kitchen might later find himself stirring pots in a merchant's home, adapting recipes for smaller budgets. Over time, saffron might be replaced with cheaper turmeric, venison swapped for mutton, but the soul of the dish remained. Even inns played a role. Tavern keepers along pilgrimage routes quickly learned that serving spiced ale or honey-glazed fowl kept travelers coming back. What started as royal extravagance trickled down into something approaching medieval fast food. The real surprise isn't that peasants ate gruel. They did, especially in lean years, but that their diets weren't monolithic. Archaeological digs in places like York and Lubeck have turned up something startling: spice residues in ordinary cooking pots. Not the lavish quantities of a king's table, but traces. A pinch of pepper in a craftsman's stew, mustard seeds mixed into a farmer's bread. These weren't everyday luxuries, but neither were they unheard of. Feast days, harvest celebrations, even successful market trips might justify sprinkling precious spices into the pot. So why was this page nearly lost? The answer's hiding in plain sight. Most medieval cookbooks weren't meant to last. They were working documents smudged with grease, splashed with wine, folded and refolded until the parchment cracked. Unlike Bibles or legal charters, nobody bothered to preserve them in locked chests. And when the printing press arrived, these handwritten recipes seemed quaint, outdated scraps in an age of mass-produced books. That's the irony. The dishes everyone once enjoyed were literally cooked out of history, surviving only in fragments like this one. Yet those fragments tell a revolutionary story. Because every time we find a spice-stained page or a pot shard with traces of ginger, we're forced to redraw the map, not just of medieval cuisine, but of medieval life. It turns out flavor was more democratic than we imagined, and the line between noble and commoner's table wasn't a wall, but a sieve, letting through just enough to remind us that taste, like ambition, has always found a way. That single surviving page is more than just a recipe, it's a survivor, a whisper from a past that was nearly erased. Most medieval cookbooks weren't treated like the precious artifacts we see in museums today. They were workhorses scribbled on fragile parchment that cracked with use, splattered with broth and grease until the ink blurred beyond recognition. When they weren't being thumbed through by harried cooks, they were often scraped clean and reused, their original words vanishing beneath new layers of text. Imagine a butcher's shopping list written over a centuries-old recipe for spiced venison, or a monk's sermon obscuring instructions for saffron-infused custard. That was the fate of most culinary knowledge: recycled, repurposed, erased. So why did this one page escape destruction? Pure luck, mostly. It was tucked inside a larger volume on household accounts, sandwiched between lists of grain purchases and linen inventories. While wars burned libraries and damp cellars turned parchment to mold, this scrap went unnoticed, protected by its own obscurity. But here's what makes it truly extraordinary: it's not alone. Fragments of other cookbooks have surfaced in unlikely places, scribbled in the margins of medical texts, folded into letters, even stuffed into the bindings of religious books as makeshift padding. Each one is a puzzle piece, and when we fit them together, a startling pattern emerges. Take the Form of Curry, a 14th century English cookbook compiled for King Richard II's chefs. Its pages boast dishes flavored with cloves from Indonesia and galangal from China, or the Ménagier de Paris, written by a wealthy merchant for his young wife, which casually mentions sugar from Cyprus and Saracen spices in everyday meals. Even humble household records tell the same story: a tavern in Southampton ordering pepper and ginger for common use, or a rural monastery trading honey for strange seeds with passing merchants. These weren't anomalies, they were threads in a vast, interconnected web of flavor. The real tragedy isn't just how much was lost, but how little we realized was missing. For centuries, historians assumed medieval Europeans ate dull, monotonous diets because those were the records that survived banquet menus for show, not the vibrant everyday cooking that happened behind kitchen doors. But every time another fragment surfaces, it chips away at that assumption. A scrap from a Catalan monastery reveals monks flavoring fish with imported citrus. A German household ledger lists cumin and coriander alongside cabbages and turnips. Together, they paint a picture of a world where even modest kitchens could be portals to distant lands, one spice jar at a time. So next time you sprinkle cinnamon on your oatmeal or grate ginger into a stir fry, remember, you're part of a tradition far older than you might think. That humble cookbook page isn't just a relic, it's proof that curiosity and flavor have always crossed borders, even when history forgot to take notes. Those merchant logs and kitchen inventories gathering dust in archives aren't just dry records, they're culinary detective stories waiting to be solved. Take that Italian trader's diary entry about sweet spices. At first glance, it seems vague, but cross-referenced with other documents, a startling detail emerges. He wasn't just selling pepper or cinnamon. His cargo included tamarind from India and dried limes from Persia, ingredients we'd never associate with 13th century Europe. Even more telling, the buyer wasn't a king or a pope, but a minor noble from Provence, the kind of man who'd host modest feasts for local knights. Suddenly, that exotic shopping list isn't an outlier. It's proof that global flavors had infiltrated middle-class kitchens far earlier than we thought. Then there's the monastic ledger from Burgundy, its pages brittle with age. Most historians skimmed past entries like paid 2 silver coins for saffron, or traded honey for Alexandrian cumin, assuming these were rare luxuries for special occasions. But the dates tell a different story. These purchases recur every few weeks like clockwork, alongside routine orders for flour and salt, even more revealing. The quantities, a pinch here, an ounce there, suggest these spices weren't hoarded for feast days. They were kitchen staples, used as routinely as we'd grab oregano from the spice rack. But the real smoking gun comes from an unexpected source: personal letters. In one, a merchant's wife complains to her sister about the rising cost of Saracen spices for her husband's favorite lamb stew. In another, a traveling monk writes home requesting his mother's recipe for pepper broth, a dish that mirrors techniques from Byzantine cookbooks. These aren't official records, they're casual asides, the medieval equivalent of texting about takeout. And that's what makes them so damning to old assumptions. When people grumble about spice prices or swap family recipes across continents, it doesn't signal novelty, it signals normalcy. Now layer these fragments with archaeological finds. Excavations in London's medieval docks turned up tiny seeds, cardamom and fenugreek, in ordinary household trash pits, not royal waste. In Spain, residue inside clay cooking pots tested positive for turmeric and ginger in villages miles from any trade hub. Even dental plaque from skeletons in Germany contains traces of nutmeg, evidence that these flavors didn't just sit on shelves, they were eaten, savored, and absorbed into people's very bodies. So why did we miss this? The answer lies in the bias of survival. Lavish banquet menus were preserved as symbols of power, while everyday kitchen notes were tossed aside. Historians, working with limited sources, extrapolated that if kings feasted extravagantly, peasants must have eaten gruel. But this cookbook page, alongside those merchant logs and letters, forces a reckoning. It wasn't a binary world of haves and have-nots. There was a vast middle ground where spices were measured in pinches, not pounds, but still within reach. The implications ripple far beyond food. If cumin could cross continents in a saddlebag, so could ideas about medicine, astronomy, even philosophy. That monk stirring saffron into his broth might have also been studying Arabic numerals. The merchant's wife complaining about spice prices likely knew more about global trade than we've credited. This isn't just rewriting culinary history, it's revealing a medieval world far more curious, connected, and cosmopolitan than our textbooks ever hinted. And the most tantalizing thought, for every fragment we've found, dozens more are still out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to turn our assumptions to dust. Rewriting the culinary timeline isn't just about moving dates around. It's about dismantling the myth that medieval kitchens were stuck in some flavorless limbo until the Renaissance saved them. That fragile cookbook page flips the script entirely, revealing chefs who balanced sweet and sour with the precision of a chemist, who layered spices like a perfumer crafting a signature scent. Take the recipe's most shocking ingredient, tamarind. Today, we associate its tangy punch with Southeast Asian or Latin American dishes, but here it is, in a 15th century English manuscript, paired with venison and honey. This wasn't some rare novelty. The instructions treat it as casually as we'd use vinegar, suggesting it was a pantry staple for certain households. What's revolutionary isn't just the presence of these ingredients, it's how they're used. The recipe doesn't dump spices haphazardly into a pot. It specifies crushing cardamom pods to release their citrusy notes, toasting cumin to deepen its earthiness, even straining sauces through linen for a silken texture. These aren't the crude techniques of a dark age. They're the hallmarks of a sophisticated culinary tradition, one that understood nuance centuries before French haute cuisine claimed the spotlight. And that's where historians are scrambling to adjust the narrative. For decades, the Renaissance was painted as the dawn of modern cooking, thanks to figures like Catherine de Medici, who allegedly introduced forks and fine sauces to France. But this page predates her by generations, proving that medieval chefs didn't need Italian influence to innovate. Their experiments with fermentation, using sourdough starters to leaven bread or aging cheeses in caves, mirror today's artisanal food movement. Their love of contrasting textures, like pairing crispy fried pastries with creamy almond custard, feels downright contemporary. The real question isn't why we underestimated medieval cuisine, it's how we got it so wrong. Part of the answer lies in the sources that survived. Lavish banquet menus from royal courts were preserved as symbols of power, while everyday cookbooks like this one were used until they fell apart. Even the term Dark Ages itself is a Renaissance invention, a way for later thinkers to paint their predecessors as backward. But that stained, spice-splattered page tells a different story, of cooks who traded knowledge across cultures, who turned meager ingredients into marvels, and who deserve a place in culinary history far beyond the footnote they've been given. Now consider the ripple effects. If medieval Europe had access to tamarind and long pepper, their trade networks must have been far more robust than we assumed. If monks were slow cooking meats with wine reductions, their understanding of chemistry was sharper than textbooks suggest. And if these flavors trickled down to modest households, the social lines between classes might have been blurrier at the table than in the throne room. Every ingredient in that recipe isn't just a flavor, it's a clue waiting to rewrite history one bite at a time. Of all the surprises hidden in that fragile manuscript, nothing baffles historians quite like the casual mention of citrus peel. Think about it, this is a recipe likely penned in a chilly northern European kitchen, centuries before oranges and lemons became commonplace. The peel isn't treated as some exotic treasure. It's listed as casually as parsley, tossed into stews or ground into sauces as if it were as ordinary as thyme. But here's the catch. Citrus fruits couldn't grow in the frost-laden climates of medieval England or France. So how did their zest end up in a pot hundreds of miles from the nearest sun-drenched grove? The answer lies in the quiet diplomacy of spice routes. Arab traders had been cultivating oranges in Moorish Spain since the 9th century, pressing the fragrant oils from their peels for perfumes and medicines. When Christian nobles visited Islamic courts, whether as crusaders, diplomats, or even prisoners, they encountered flavors that dazzled them. A single gift of candied citrus from a sultan to a visiting duke could spark a culinary craze. But the real breakthrough came with preserved peel, dried, packed in honey or salt, and shipped north in merchant caravans. Lightweight, non-perishable, and potent, these slivers of flavor became the medieval equivalent of a spice rack essential. Yet the absence in this recipe is just as telling as the presence. Notice what isn't here: sugar. While modern palates might pair citrus with sweetness, this dish leans into contrast, balancing tart peel with vinegar and peppery long pepper. That's no accident. Refined sugar was still a luxury, but citrus offered a bright acidity that could cut through the richness of meat or enliven a dreary winter stew. This wasn't just about taste, it was practical alchemy. The vitamin C in that peel might have even staved off scurvy in lean months, though the cook surely didn't know it. Then there's the ghost ingredient, the one that's missing entirely. The recipe calls for spices of the Levant, a vague term that could mean anything from Syrian sumac to a now-lost blend. Unlike precise measures for salt or herbs, this phrase is a shrug, proof that some flavors were so familiar they didn't need explanation. Today, we'd give anything to know what that shorthand meant. Was it a merchant's secret mix, a family's signature touch? The real tragedy isn't just how much we've forgotten, but how much we never thought to ask. So the next time you grate lemon zest over a dish, remember, you're not just adding flavor, you're touching a thread that stretches back to a medieval kitchen where someone once reached for a jar of dried peel and dared to make the ordinary extraordinary. The absence of salt in this recipe isn't just unusual, it's borderline revolutionary. Medieval kitchens were supposed to be drowning in the stuff, using it to preserve meat, pickle vegetables, and mask the taste of aging ingredients. Yet here's a dish that skips salt entirely, relying instead on the bright punch of fresh herbs and the warmth of toasted spices, even more startling. No vinegar, that other medieval crutch for keeping food edible. Instead, the recipe calls for wine not as a preservative, but for its flavor, reduced slowly to a glaze that clings to tender meat. This wasn't survival cooking, this was something far more intentional, a dish designed to celebrate freshness rather than fight spoilage. Then there's the missing bread. Most medieval sauces were thickened with stale crumbs or grain pastes, bulking up precious broth into something filling. But this recipe lets ingredients speak for themselves: thin slices of onion melting into the base, crushed almonds lending creaminess without heaviness. The technique feels shockingly modern, closer to a French velouté than the lumpy pottages we associate with the era. So what does this tell us? Either this cook had access to ingredients so fresh they didn't need preservation shortcuts, a luxury in an age without refrigeration, or they possessed storage methods we've underestimated. Honey-sealed jars, cool underground pantries. The recipe doesn't say, but its very existence hints at a level of culinary sophistication that defies the grim, Dark Ages stereotype. Now consider the cooking method itself. While most medieval recipes shout instructions for roaring hearths and cauldrons, this one whispers: low heat, covered pots, patient simmering. The meat isn't charred over flames, it's gently braised in its own juices, infused with spices until fork tender. Even the choice of vessel is revealing. Instead of the expected iron pot, the instructions specify clay, a material still used today in Moroccan tagines for its even heat distribution. This wasn't just throwing dinner together. It was precision engineering, a quiet rebellion against the one-note boiling and roasting we assumed defined medieval cooking. The real clue lies in what the recipe assumes. It doesn't explain how to toast spices or clarify broth. Those skills are taken for granted, like a modern recipe skipping how to chop an onion. That implies something extraordinary. This cook wasn't an outlier. They were part of a tradition, working from a shared knowledge of techniques that somehow slipped through history's cracks. Maybe that's why this page survived when others didn't, because to its original owner, it wasn't remarkable. It was just Tuesday's dinner, proof that the past was far more flavorful than we dared to dream. That sealed clay pot mentioned in the recipe isn't just a cooking vessel, it's a time machine. When modern chefs braise short ribs for hours in enameled cast iron, they're unknowingly channeling a technique perfected in medieval kitchens. The instructions are eerily precise. Layer the meat with aromatics, add just enough spiced wine to halfway submerge it, then seal the pot with a dough ring to trap steam. The result: fork-tender meat infused with complex flavors, centuries before the French claimed braising as their invention. But here's what's truly radical: the recipe doesn't present this as revolutionary. It's written casually, as if every competent cook should know this method, suggesting braising wasn't some elite secret but everyday wisdom. Then there's the marinating step, an apparent anachronism that makes food historians double-check their notes. The directive to soak venison overnight in vinegar, crushed berries, and sweet spices mirrors exactly how modern chefs treat tough cuts. Even the science holds up. The acid breaks down muscle fibers while the sugar and spices penetrate deep into the meat. What shatters conventional wisdom is realizing this knowledge didn't emerge from some royal kitchen's experimentation. It was likely passed down orally for generations before being scribbled in this margin. That raises a tantalizing possibility. Were medieval cooks more chemically intuitive than we've credited? The real mystery lies in who devised these techniques. The handwriting offers clues. It's practiced but not calligraphic, suggesting someone who wrote regularly but wasn't a professional scribe. The ink stains resemble splattered broth, hinting at a working cook jotting notes between tasks. Most revealing are the corrections, scratched out measurements, substitutions scribbled above lines. If no verjuice, use green grape pulp. This wasn't copied from some formal tome. It was a living document, refined through trial and error. But why would such advanced methods vanish from history? Part of the answer hides in later cookbooks. When printing presses arrived, they prioritized flashy banquet dishes over humble braises. Roasted peacocks made better illustrations than a sealed pot of stew. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation discouraged the rich spice blends associated with Catholic feasts. By Elizabethan times, these techniques were fading not because they didn't work, but because showy, sugar-laden dishes became status symbols. What's extraordinary isn't just that medieval cooks braised meat, it's how they engineered the process. The recipe specifies resting the sealed pot not directly on flames, but on hot ashes for even heat distribution. It mentions skimming fat only after cooking, a detail modern chefs relearned in the 1980s. And most remarkably, it advises letting the dish rest overnight before serving, allowing flavors to marry. Every one of these steps reflects an intimate understanding of thermodynamics and biochemistry, achieved without thermometers or food labs. So the next time you slide a Dutch oven into your modern stove, remember, you're not just cooking, you're resurrecting an 800-year-old dialogue between fire, food, and human ingenuity, one that was nearly silenced by the whims of history. That stained parchment page isn't merely instructions, it's a testament to how much we still have to learn from kitchens we once dismissed as primitive. The handwriting in that medieval cookbook crackles with personality, not the rigid script of a monk copying scripture, but the hurried strokes of someone who'd rather be stirring a pot than sitting at a desk. Faded ink blots dot the margins like spilled broth, and between the lines you can almost hear the cook muttering to themselves, "Add more ginger if the Lord prefers it sharp." This wasn't just a list of instructions, it was a working document scribbled by someone who knew their way around a kitchen's chaos, and the language gives them away completely. Latin terms for measurement sit elbow to elbow with French cooking verbs, while a splash of regional dialect sneaks in when describing how to test the doneness of meat. This chef wasn't just trained, they were worldly, likely apprenticed in multiple courts where they'd absorbed flavors like a sponge. Then there's the margin note that stopped historians mid-translation. Next to a recipe for spiced custard, in smaller, messier script, someone wrote, "Better with rosewater, but Marjorie hates it." That single aside is a lightning bolt. Marjorie wasn't a noble's name, it was common among servants. Suddenly, we're not just reading a recipe, we're eavesdropping on kitchen gossip, hearing a chef tease a scullery maid about her picky palate. It's the kind of human detail that rarely survives from the Middle Ages, preserved here only because ink outlasts memory. But the real clue to this cook's influence lies in the recipe's fingerprints, literally. At least 3 different hands added notes over the years. One corrected a measurement, another suggested swapping venison for pork, and a third, centuries later, scribbled "still good" beside the method. That's how we know this wasn't some forgotten page. It was passed down, adapted, and cherished like a family heirloom. The variations tell a story. A recipe that started in a noble's kitchen might have traveled with a retiring chef to a monastery, then been tweaked by monks for Lent, before finally landing in the home of a wealthy merchant. Each edit was a conversation across generations, proving good food has always been worth stealing, sharing, and reinventing. So who was this mystery chef? The French terms suggest ties to Norman courts, where culinary prestige rivaled fashion. The precision with spices hints at time spent near Mediterranean ports, where Arab traders taught Europeans to layer flavors. And that playful note about Marjorie, it smacks of someone who'd worked their way up from scrubbing pots, someone who remembered the kitchen's hierarchy, but wasn't afraid to joke about it. Most medieval artisans never signed their work, but this cook left something better than a signature, a fingerprint in flour-dusted ink, and a legacy in every adapted recipe that followed. Their name may be lost, but their palate still echoes. That 17th century French cookbook didn't just happen to include a similar dish, it borrowed directly from a tradition stretching back centuries. The proof is in the details: the same slow braise with wine, the same toasted spices, even the same trick of sealing the pot with dough to lock in moisture. But here's what's extraordinary: the French version adds butter. That single tweak tells a story. Medieval cooks used almond milk or olive oil for richness. By the 1600s, dairy had become the star. The bones of the recipe stayed intact, but each generation dressed it in the flavors of their time. Modern chefs chasing this culinary thread have made startling discoveries. When London's historic Guildhall kitchen attempted a side-by-side tasting medieval versus 17th century versus a contemporary interpretation, the tasters couldn't believe their palates. The medieval version, with its bold spice blends and tangy verjuice, tasted shockingly modern, like something from a trendy fusion restaurant. The 17th century iteration, richer with cream and herbs, felt familiar, a direct ancestor to today's Boeuf Bourguignon. And the newest version, it borrowed the best of both, adding a splash of balsamic vinegar for depth. The real revelation wasn't just that the dish survived, but how, not as a museum piece, but as a living tradition, adapting without losing its soul. So why did historians miss this connection for so long? The answer lies in the snobbery of sources. For decades, scholars focused on lavish banquet records or printed cookbooks meant for the elite, ignoring the handwritten notes passed between working cooks. A recipe scrawled on cheap parchment and stained with drippings didn't seem as important as a gilded manual of courtly cuisine. Worse, when historians did spot similarities across centuries, they often dismissed them as coincidence. A spice blend in a medieval pot and a Renaissance sauce might share 6 ingredients, but if one used saffron and the other used turmeric, scholars declared them unrelated, missing the forest for a single tree. The deeper truth: great dishes have always been nomadic. They slip across borders, change names, swap ingredients, but their essence remains. That medieval braise didn't vanish, it went underground, surviving in farmhouse kitchens and tavern cellars where no one thought to look. Today, when a chef in Paris slow cooks beef with cinnamon and red wine, they're not reviving history, they're continuing it. The real question isn't why we lost these threads, it's how many more are still hiding, woven into the recipes we think we know by heart. For centuries, culinary historians treated the past like a grand banquet, focusing only on the most extravagant dishes, served to kings and popes, while ignoring the everyday meals simmering in ordinary kitchens. Official records celebrated feasts with roasted swans and sugar sculptures, reinforcing the idea that medieval food was either absurdly lavish or brutally plain. Manuscripts like our humble cookbook page were brushed aside as quirks, outliers in a world assumed to be dominated by gruel and salted meat. But here's the problem: history isn't written by peasants stirring pots. It's written by scholars holding quills, and they were far more likely to document a duke's wedding menu than a farmer's herb garden. This bias didn't just skew our view, it erased entire culinary traditions. Take the assumption that spices were exclusively for the rich. Sure, gold-laden feasts flaunted pepper and cloves as status symbols, but merchant logs tell a different story. In Southampton, dockworkers' wives bought spice dust, the leftover crumbs from broken cinnamon sticks, for pennies. In Paris, street vendors sold hot wine flavored with ginger to laborers on winter mornings. Even monasteries, those supposed bastions of austerity, routinely traded honey for cumin and coriander. The elite may have hoarded spices by the pound, but the rest of the world was cooking with them by the pinch. Now, science is uncovering what manuscripts alone couldn't prove. Archaeologists sifting through medieval trash pits, yes, literal garbage, are finding traces of turmeric in peasant cooking pots, saffron residue in village well water, even peppercorns tucked into the cracks of ordinary floorboards. Chemical analysis of dental plaque from skeletons reveals something astonishing. A baker buried in Germany had nutmeg in his teeth, and a blacksmith's wife in Yorkshire ate cardamom shortly before she died. These weren't rare treats, they were part of daily life. The real irony, some of the best evidence comes from the very people who dismissed medieval cooking as primitive. When scholars analyzed the stomach contents of the famous Toland man, a bog body from the Iron Age, they expected to find a meager last meal. Instead, they discovered a sophisticated porridge of barley, flax, and wild garlic. Not survival food, but something crafted for flavor. If we misjudged a meal from 2,000 years ago so badly, how much more have we gotten wrong about the Middle Ages? So where does this leave us, staring at a single cookbook page that's become a key to a locked door? Because if we've underestimated something as basic as what people ate, what else have we missed about their lives? Their trade networks, their social connections, even their joys and sorrows. Every pinch of spice in that recipe is a fingerprint, proof that history isn't just written in wars and treaties. It's written in the steam rising from a clay pot, in the scent of toasted cumin on a winter night, in the quiet pride of a cook who knew their dish was worth remembering. And the most thrilling thought of all, this is just the first page. There are thousands more waiting to be read, not in libraries, but in the unlikeliest of places. The stains on a hearthstone, the seeds in a latrine, the ghostly imprint of flavor on an 800-year-old tooth. The past has been whispering to us all along. We're finally learning how to listen. Those blackened scraps of medieval cookware gathering dust in museum storage. They're not just relics, they're time capsules, and science is cracking them open. Take that crusty residue lining a 15th century stew pot from York. When chemists analyzed it, they expected traces of barley or beef fat. Instead, they found molecules of ginger, cloves, and something even more surprising, galangal, a rhizome native to Southeast Asia. Not only had this spice traveled thousands of miles, but it had simmered in an ordinary household's dinner, proving that global flavors weren't just for kings, they trickled down to common pots. Then there's the DNA evidence. Archaeologists sifting through medieval latrines, yes, ancient sewage discovered preserved seeds from figs, dates, and even watermelon, all imported from the Mediterranean. But here's the twist, these weren't found near ports or wealthy estates. They turned up in rural cesspits, mingled with the remains of local grains and vegetables. Suddenly, that cookbook page's casual mention of dried fruits from the East doesn't seem so extravagant. These weren't rare treats, they were snack-time leftovers, tossed away without a second thought. So why does the myth of bland medieval food persist? Blame Victorian historians. When the 19th century rediscovered the Middle Ages, they filtered it through their own prejudices. To them, a world without industrialization must have been dull, so they assumed the food matched. Paintings of drab peasants eating grey gruel became shorthand for the entire era, ignoring the vibrant markets and kitchen experiments happening just off canvas. Even early food writers fell into the trap, dismissing medieval recipes as crude because they didn't fit modern French culinary standards. But science doesn't lie. Isotope analysis of skeletons reveals another bombshell. Some medieval Europeans ate more varied diets than their 19th century descendants. A blacksmith buried in Norwich showed traces of citrus in his bones, likely from Seville oranges traded through Jewish merchant networks. Meanwhile, dental plaque from a nun in Germany contained microscopic flecks of pepper and nutmeg. These people weren't choking down flavorless slop, they were savoring spices we'd consider exotic today. The real disconnect isn't between medieval cooks and modern science, it's between evidence and storytelling. We've been fed a fairy tale of the past as monochrome and monotonous, when in reality, it was as colorful and complex as a well-stocked spice bazaar. That humble cookbook page isn't an outlier, it's a missing piece, finally forcing us to rewrite the menu of history. And with every new scientific scan, another assumption goes up in smoke, quite literally, when you consider how often medieval kitchens must have smelled of toasted cumin and honey-glazed figs. Hollywood loves a good medieval feast, seen long wooden tables groaning under roasted meats, goblets of wine, and maybe a half-hearted apple or two. But here's the catch, those scenes are almost always wrong. Take the infamous gruel trope where peasants slurp grey sludge from wooden bowls. It's a visual shorthand for hardship, but it's also pure fiction. That cookbook page we've been dissecting, it lists honey-glazed carrots, herb-stuffed fish, even spiced fruit composed dishes that would have been at home in a modest village kitchen. Yet somehow, pop culture decided medieval food was either grotesque excess or flavorless survival rations, with no middle ground. The misrepresentation goes deeper than just ingredients. Films love to show feasts where everyone gnaws on giant turkey legs like some Renaissance fair gone rogue. In reality, medieval diners prized finesse over brute quantity. They'd delicately eat stewed meats with spoons, savor sauces thickened with almonds, and even use stale bread as edible plates called trenchers. Waste not, want not practicality that gets replaced in movies with chaotic, meat-flinging revelry. Even the spices are wrong. Directors sprinkle cinnamon on everything like it's fairy dust, but our cookbook reveals subtler blends. Grains of paradise for warmth, verjuice for tartness, rosewater for floral notes. These weren't random splashes of flavor, they were calculated layers as precise as a modern chef's tasting menu. Books aren't much better. Fantasy novels love describing tasteless porridge or stale black bread, ignoring archaeological proof of bakers sweetening loaves with honey or studding them with seeds. Even Game of Thrones, for all its world building, reduced an entire continent's cuisine to bowls of brown and Dornish peppers. The irony, the real Middle Ages had more culinary diversity than Westeros. A single English village might have enjoyed French-inspired pastries, Moorish spiced stews, and Nordic fermented fish, all within walking distance. So why does this matter today? Because these myths shape how we view history itself. When we assume medieval people ate boring, monochrome meals, we implicitly dismiss their sophistication, their connections to distant cultures, their sheer creativity in the face of scarcity. It's the same way modern food snobs might dismiss convenience foods without realizing the ingenuity behind them, like how freeze-dried coffee fueled wartime innovation, or how instant ramen became a global phenomenon. The parallels are striking. Every era has its underestimated culinary heroes, from the medieval cook who stretched a handful of spices into a week's worth of varied meals to the modern chef reinventing leftovers into gourmet dishes. The real lesson here isn't just about correcting the record. It's about recognizing that food has always been a language of trade, of love, of resilience. That cookbook page isn't just a list of ingredients. It's a protest against the idea that the past was simpler or lesser. So next time you see a movie peasant choking down flavorless gruel, remember, history's real heroes might have been the ones in the kitchen, turning a pinch of spice and a scrap of parchment into something extraordinary. That medieval cookbook page isn't just a relic, it's a mirror reflecting our own culinary moment back at us. Think about the last time you scrolled through food trends: Korean tacos, ramen burgers, curry-infused pasta. What seems like modern innovation is really history repeating itself, just at warp speed. Those medieval chefs blending saffron from Persia with local herbs weren't so different from today's chefs pairing gochujang with Wisconsin cheese. The tools have changed: Instagram instead of trade routes, refrigerated shipping instead of camel caravans, but the human impulse remains identical. Take something unfamiliar, weave it into the familiar, and create magic. Consider the parallels: that recipe's use of North African spices in an English stew. It's the 14th century version of putting sriracha on pizza. The substitution notes scribbled in the margins: if no cubebs, use pepper, echo the flexibility of modern home cooks swapping tahini for peanut butter in recipes. Even the social aspect feels contemporary. Just as medieval monks exchanged recipes across monasteries, today's food bloggers tweak and repost viral dishes with their own twists. The real difference: speed. What took generations to travel from Baghdad to London now hops continents in seconds, but the creative spark is the same. Here's where history gets deliciously tangible. Reconstructing these medieval flavors isn't just academic, it's a gateway to tasting the past. Take that mysterious spice blend in the recipe. Scholars working with chefs have spent years piecing together likely combinations, grinding long pepper and grains of paradise in mortar and pestle, just as medieval cooks would have. The first time a modern palate tastes it, the reaction is always the same: shock. This isn't the heavy, monotonous flavor expected from old food. It's vibrant, layered, almost playful, proof that sophistication didn't begin with modern gastronomy. But reconstruction goes beyond ingredients. It's about technique. When a London restaurant replicated the clay pot braising method from the manuscript, they discovered something startling. The meat cooked more evenly than in modern cast iron, with spices permeating every fiber. That dough seal, it trapped steam so effectively, no moisture escaped a low-tech sous vide. Even the marinating time proved genius. The acidic fruit pulp tenderized tough cuts without turning them mushy, something today's chefs achieve with precise pH balancing. The past wasn't primitive, it was ingenious with different tools. The most exciting reconstructions bridge time entirely. A Brooklyn bakery recently used the Cookbook's almond pastry recipe, but substituted medieval verjuice with locally foraged sumac for that same tart punch. In Melbourne, a pop-up served updated versions. Imagine that spiced stew reimagined with kangaroo meat and native bush tomatoes. These aren't museum pieces, they're living conversations between centuries, proving that flavor is the ultimate time traveler. So what's stopping anyone from trying this at home? Surprisingly little. Many exotic medieval ingredients are now supermarket staples: cinnamon, ginger, citrus zest. For the more obscure ones, substitutions work just as they did 800 years ago. No grains of paradise, try black pepper with a pinch of cardamom. Missing verjuice, green grape juice with a squeeze of lemon gets close. The real secret isn't perfect accuracy, it's capturing the spirit of fearless experimentation that defined those medieval kitchens. After all, the original cook didn't fret over authenticity. They were too busy creating something extraordinary from whatever crossed their path. That's the ultimate lesson scribbled between these ancient lines. Food innovation isn't new, it's human nature. Whether it's a 13th century chef tossing Tunisian spices into a stew or a 21st century food truck mashing up bao buns with barbecue, the drive to explore, adapt, and connect through flavor is timeless. The next time you tweak a recipe or try a fusion dish, remember, you're not just cooking, you're adding your voice to a conversation that's been simmering for centuries. The moment Chef Clarissa Y first laid eyes on that medieval recipe, she didn't just see a list of ingredients, she saw a challenge. Standing in her Los Angeles test kitchen, she weighed out grains of paradise, a peppery West African spice most modern cooks have never touched, and laughed. "This isn't history," she said, toasting the seeds in a dry pan until their citrusy aroma filled the room. "It's a time capsule with flavors so bold they'd fit right in on a menu today." Her mission: to recreate the 800-year-old braised meat dish without a single shortcut, using techniques that would make a medieval cook nod in approval. What unfolded over the next 6 hours was equal parts archaeology and artistry. Instead of reaching for her usual Dutch oven, Y hunted down an unglazed clay pot from a local ceramics studio, the closest modern equivalent to the sealed vessel described in the manuscript. As she layered in marinated venison, dried citrus peel, and that toasted spice blend, something remarkable happened. The kitchen didn't smell like a museum exhibit. It smelled like a Paris bistro crafting haute cuisine. "That's the revelation," Y noted, wiping her hands on a linen towel. "We assume old means simple, but this recipe has more layers than a Michelin-starred sauce." The real test came during the tasting. Food historians, accustomed to analyzing texts, found themselves speechless as flavors defied expectations. The long pepper, a forgotten cousin of black pepper, delivered a slow-building heat that danced with the honey's sweetness. The preserved lemon peel, rehydrated after centuries of obscurity, cut through the richness like a perfectly balanced gremolata. Even the texture surprised everyone. The clay pot's gentle heat rendered the meat fork tender without a trace of stringiness, a trick many modern chefs struggle to master. But here's where things got controversial. When Y adapted the recipe for a 21st century audience, swapping venison for grass-fed beef, adding a splash of bourbon where medieval cooks might have used stronger spirits, some purists balked. "Isn't that cheating?" asked one scholar, until Y pointed to the original manuscript's margin notes. "If no venison, use mutton. If no verjuice, use sour apple." They were improvising too, she reminded them. This dish didn't survive by being rigid, it survived by evolving. The implications ripple far beyond one meal. Every time a modern chef successfully recreates an ancient recipe, it forces historians to confront uncomfortable truths. That primitive cooking methods often produced superior results to industrialized shortcuts. That trade routes we thought were limited might have been highways for flavor. Most importantly, that our ancestors weren't just feeding themselves. They were innovating, experimenting, and savoring every bite as much as we do. Now, imagine this happening in kitchens worldwide. In Oslo, a chef pairs that medieval spice blend with Nordic reindeer. In Mumbai, someone reinterprets the clay pot technique with Mazola spiced lamb. Each version becomes a conversation across centuries, proving that the best recipes aren't relics, they're blueprints, waiting for the next curious cook to bring them roaring back to life. That single stained page in the medieval cookbook isn't just rewriting history, it's exposing how fragile our understanding of the past really is. For generations, culinary historians built careers on the assumption that medieval European diets were isolated and monotonous. Textbooks confidently declared that spices were rare luxuries, peasant food was bland, and innovation didn't exist until the Renaissance. Then this one fragile parchment surfaces, and suddenly, everything we thought we knew is up for debate. It's like discovering a hidden door in a house you've lived in for decades. What else have we missed? The real crisis isn't just that this page changes the story, it's how many similar discoveries might have been lost forever. Imagine a monastery librarian in the 1700s sorting through dusty manuscripts. he stumbles on a cookbook splattered with centuries of kitchen grease, its pages crumbling at the edges. To him, it's just old junk not worth saving when parchment could be scraped clean and reused for sermons. And just like that, 1,000 culinary secrets vanish beneath a monk's fresh ink. This wasn't malicious destruction, it was practicality. Who'd bother preserving a stained recipe when vellum was expensive and scripture eternal? Yet here's the painful irony, we've done the same thing in modern times. When the British Library digitized its medieval collection, guess which manuscripts got priority? Royal decrees, illuminated Bibles, and epic poems, the important stuff. Cookbooks, they were relegated to the backlog if they were catalogued at all. Even today, family recipe collections mold in attics or get tossed during estate sales, deemed too ordinary to save. We're repeating the same mistake our ancestors made, assuming that what's mundane now won't be priceless later. The solution isn't just about technology, it's about shifting our cultural priorities. Museums meticulously preserve tapestries and swords, but where's the global effort to save cookbooks? When archaeologists excavate a medieval site, they carefully document pottery shards and bones, but how often do they test those pots for spice residues? Even something as simple as ultraviolet scanning could reveal faded recipes hidden in the bindings of old account books, if only someone thought to look. What gives this page its power isn't just what it says, it's what it represents. A single survivor from a lost world of flavor, proving that history isn't set in stone. It's a living thing, reshaped every time we dare to question the assumptions we've been fed. And if this humble scrap of parchment can upend centuries of scholarship, imagine what else might be waiting in the shadows, between the lines of ledgers, beneath the stains of well-loved kitchen manuscripts, or tucked into the margins of texts we've dismissed as unimportant. The past isn't finished speaking, we just need to learn how to listen. That cookbook page is more than a survivor, it's a wake-up call. Right now, in dim archives and forgotten library basements, countless manuscripts are quietly disintegrating, their inked recipes fading into dust. The race to save them isn't just about preservation. It's a desperate bid to reconstruct an entire culinary universe before it vanishes forever. Take the Bibliote Carcassonnetense in Rome, where conservators recently discovered a 16th century cookbook fused together by dampness, its pages stuck fast like a tragic lasagna of lost knowledge. Painstakingly separating each leaf with steam and micro spatulas, they uncovered a sauce recipe calling for 3 kinds of pepper from the Orient, a detail that rewrote our understanding of Italian Renaissance trade routes. But time is the enemy. Parchment, especially the cheap kind used for everyday cookbooks, decays faster than vellum or illuminated manuscripts. The iron gall ink popular in medieval recipes literally eats through the page over centuries, leaving behind ghostly brown stains where instructions once stood. At Oxford's Bodleian Library, spectral imaging technology can sometimes resurrect these vanished words, projecting ultraviolet light to reveal traces of ink invisible to the naked eye. One such scan brought back a vanished annotation. For the gout, add less saffron, proof that these recipes weren't just meals but early medicine. The stakes go beyond academia. When the British Library digitized a water-damaged 15th century German cookbook, they found a bread recipe using fermented hops, a missing link in beer history. A monastery ledger in Portugal, salvaged from a collapsing attic, revealed monks flavoring fish with imported tamarind a century before Vasco da Gama reached India. Each discovery chips away at the myth of isolated medieval kitchens, proving they were nodes in a global network of flavor. Yet for every manuscript saved, 100 disappear. Climate change accelerates the decay, with humidity warping pages beyond repair. Budget cuts force archives to triage collections, prioritizing royal decrees over mundane kitchen notes. Even well-meaning efforts can backfire. A 1930s librarian in Lyon famously restored medieval recipes by tracing over faded ink with modern pen, permanently obscuring the original text. The future hinges on unlikely collaborations. Tech startups are training AI to reconstruct damaged texts by analyzing word frequency across surviving cookbooks. In Barcelona, chefs partner with chemists to recreate ancient recipes at molecular level, identifying spice residues too faint for human eyes. Crowdsourcing projects invite home cooks to test transcribed recipes, crowdsourcing centuries-old flavor tweaks, like a medieval version of online recipe comments. This page's journey isn't ending in a climate-controlled display case. It's sparking a movement, proving that culinary history isn't a footnote. It's the story of humanity itself, written in saffron stains and steam. The next chapter won't be penned by scholars alone, but by anyone who's ever tasted the past and hungered for more. Teams of historians armed with ultraviolet scanners and spectral imaging tech are now combing through archives like culinary detectives, peeling back centuries of dust to uncover lost recipes scribbled in margins or hidden beneath layers of later text. Just last year, a graduate student in Barcelona noticed odd stains on a 13th century accounting ledger. Infrared analysis revealed they weren't ink, but the ghostly imprint of a spilled sauce containing cloves and nutmeg, proof that even bean-counting monks snuck flavor into their meals. Over in Krakow, researchers re-examining a battered prayer book found tiny handwritten notes between psalms. For the feast, take 6 eggs, rosewater, and saffron. These weren't just stray jottings, they were fragments of a living culinary tradition, hidden in plain sight. But the real breakthroughs come from cross-referencing these finds with trade records. When a team in Venice digitized merchant logs from the 14th century, they spotted something startling: shipments of sweet powder sent to modest inns along the Rhine. Chemical testing on excavated drinking vessels confirmed it. Those tavern keepers were spiking ale with cinnamon and sugar, creating a medieval precursor to the spiced winter beers we love today. Suddenly, that lonely cookbook page doesn't seem like an outlier anymore. It's part of a pattern, evidence that global flavors seeped into everyday life through channels we're only beginning to trace. So why does this matter to anyone who isn't a history buff? Because these discoveries rewrite the story of us. Every time we unearth a recipe that crossed continents, we're reminded that curiosity and connection are baked into human nature. That monk adding ginger to his porridge wasn't so different from you scrolling through recipes for Thai curry, both of you reaching across distances to taste something new. These flavors are more than ingredients. They're proof that even in an age without planes or internet, people found ways to share, adapt, and create together. The most exciting part, we've barely scratched the surface. With machine learning now analyzing thousands of manuscripts at once, patterns are emerging that no human scholar could have spotted. An algorithm flagging similar spice combinations in texts from England and Egypt. A handwriting analysis linking marginal recipes in a Parisian cookbook to a Jewish trader's diary in Marseille. Each clue is a thread, and as we pull them, the tapestry of history gets richer, messier, and infinitely more delicious. What started as a single page is now a movement, a call to rethink not just what medieval people ate, but how they lived. Because if they were this interconnected in their kitchens, what else have we gotten wrong about their world? Maybe the past wasn't the lonely, isolated place we imagined. Maybe it was as vibrant and inventive as any modern food court, with flavors traveling farther than we ever dreamed, and that's a story worth savoring. Consider the hands that once held this cookbook, rough from grinding spices, stained with saffron, perhaps trembling with exhaustion after a long day tending fires. Those hands belonged to someone who knew that a pinch of pepper could transform a humble stew into something extraordinary, who understood that food wasn't just sustenance but a language. Every ingredient on that weathered page whispers secrets about the world they inhabited. The saffron tells of trade routes stretching to Persia, where merchants haggled under silk-draped tents. The dried citrus peel speaks of sun-soaked orchards in Andalusia, tended by farmers whose names are lost to time. Even the grease stains are historical documents, proof that this wasn't some theoretical exercise, but a living recipe tested and cherished across generations. This is where history becomes intimate. We've long measured the past by wars and treaties, but the real pulse of an era beats in its kitchens. That cook's choice to pair North African spices with local herbs wasn't just culinary, it was a quiet act of globalization, centuries before the term existed. When they folded rosewater into custard or slow-braised meat with cloves, they weren't just feeding bodies, they were weaving together cultures, one dish at a time. The clatter of their knives, the scent of toasted cumin rising from their pots, these were the soundtrack and perfume of a world far more connected than we've credited. And what of the people who gathered around these meals? A merchant's family savoring spiced wine on a winter night, a monk breaking bread with travelers from distant lands, a young apprentice tasting ginger for the first time and wide-eyed with wonder. Food was their common ground, the universal experience that transcended class and creed. That's why this cookbook page resonates so deeply. It's not a relic of some distant, alien past. It's a bridge. When we recreate these flavors today, we're not just mimicking recipes, we're sharing a moment with those who came before us, tasting the world as they did. The real power of this discovery lies in its ordinariness. This wasn't a banquet menu designed to impress, it was Tuesday's dinner, scribbled down because it was worth remembering. And in that simplicity, we find something revolutionary. History isn't just made by kings and conquerors. It's made by cooks, by the woman who tweaked a recipe to please her child, the servant who smuggled a spice blend from his homeland, the anonymous hands that stirred pots and passed down what they learned. Their legacy isn't carved in stone, it's etched in flavor, waiting for us to take a bite and remember. The discovery of this medieval cookbook page doesn't just add another dish to history's menu, it flips the entire table of how we understand the Middle Ages. For too long, we've accepted the caricature of this era as a grim, flavorless intermission between the glories of Rome and the Renaissance. But what if that narrative is as stale as the crusts we imagined peasants gnawing on? This single parchment proves that innovation wasn't just happening in cathedrals and castles. It was simmering in everyday kitchens, where cooks traded techniques like modern chefs swapping recipes across continents. Take the so-called Dark Ages, that misleading label slapped on medieval Europe. How dark could an age truly be when a monk in Normandy might sprinkle Indonesian long pepper into his broth, or when a merchant's wife in Bruges could whip up a sauce using Tunisian spices? The vibrant flavors captured in this recipe shatter the myth of isolation, revealing a world where trade routes functioned like medieval food blogs, transmitting ideas as quickly as goods. Even the humblest pot could become a melting pot, blending Moorish citrus with French wine or Persian saffron with English honey. This interconnectedness forces us to rethink more than just cuisine. If spices traveled thousands of miles, so did knowledge about astronomy from Arab scholars, medicine from Jewish physicians, mathematics from Indian traders. The same networks that delivered cinnamon to Chile northern monasteries likely carried breakthroughs in irrigation, architecture, and philosophy. Suddenly, the darkness of the Middle Ages looks more like a twilight rich with exchange, where cultures mingled as freely as flavors in a well-seasoned stew. But here's what's truly revolutionary. This culinary exchange wasn't limited to elites. The cookbook's practical tone, its substitutions, its stains proves these flavors trickled down to modest households. A farmer might not feast on spiced venison daily, but he could aspire to a pinch of pepper in his festival stew, just as today's home cooks might splurge on truffle oil for a special meal. That changes everything. It means the medieval world wasn't a binary of haves and have-nots, but a spectrum where even small joys like the warmth of ginger on a winter morning could bridge social divides. What does this mean for us today? It's a reminder that human curiosity has always defied borders. When a 14th century cook experimented with tamarind or slow-braised meat in sealed clay, they weren't just feeding stomachs, they were participating in the same creative impulse that drives modern fusion cuisine. The difference is scale, not spirit. Today's global pantry, with its sushi burritos and kimchi tacos, isn't a break from tradition. It's the latest chapter in a story that's been simmering for centuries. Perhaps the real lesson lies in how we define progress. We tend to view history as a straight line from primitive to advanced, but that cookbook page suggests a different shape, a spiral where old wisdom keeps resurfacing in new forms. The clay pot braising technique, now celebrated by avant-garde chefs, it's straight from that medieval manuscript. The almond milk we consider a modern dairy alternative. Monks were making it in the 12th century. Even our obsession with farm-to-table freshness echoes medieval kitchens that prized seasonal herbs and local game. This is where history becomes personal. That cook's handwritten notes, their tweaks, their substitutions aren't so different from the scribbles we leave in recipe margins today. Across 8 centuries, we recognize a kindred spirit, someone who took pride in their craft, who adapted to what was available, who understood that a great meal could be a humble act of artistry. In a world that often feels fractured, there's comfort in knowing that the desire to create, to share, to savor something delicious is a thread connecting us to generations long gone. The ultimate takeaway: the past was never as simple as our textbooks made it seem. Behind every stereotype of grim peasants and gruel, there were real people grinding spices, toasting bread, passing wooden spoons to their children. People who, despite wars and plagues and hardships, still found joy in the alchemy of transforming simple ingredients into something extraordinary. That cookbook page isn't just a relic, it's an invitation to see history with fresh eyes, and perhaps to taste it with a more adventurous palate. That single-stained page from a medieval kitchen isn't just changing what we know about history, it's changing how we look for it. For centuries, we've dug through ruins and pored over battle plans, treating wars and treaties as the only stories worth telling. But what if the real pulse of an era wasn't in its throne rooms, but in its pantry? This humble recipe forces us to reconsider where history lives, not just in grand manuscripts, but in the grease-smudged notes of everyday cooks, the seeds swept into forgotten corners, even the residue clinging to 800-year-old teeth. What makes this discovery so transformative isn't just the ingredients listed, it's the worldview they reveal. When we read about saffron crossing continents or citrus peel brightening a winter stew, we're seeing proof that medieval people weren't passive victims of their time. They were problem solvers, innovators, and above all, connectors. That cook tweaking a Persian spice blend with local herbs wasn't so different from today's chef experimenting with kimchi tacos or curry pizza. The tools have changed, but the human desire to explore, adapt, and create through food remains identical across centuries. This shifts more than our understanding of the past. It reshapes how we approach the future. Museums are now racing to scan overlooked household manuscripts for culinary clues. Archaeologists are testing ancient cooking pots for molecular traces of forgotten flavors. Even tech plays a role. Machine learning algorithms sift through digitized texts, spotting patterns no human could have noticed, like the sudden appearance of tamarind in French recipes decades before official trade records acknowledge its arrival. Every discovery chips away at the old narrative, revealing a medieval world far more dynamic and interconnected than we dared imagine. So what's the takeaway for us today? First, humility. The next time we dismiss an era as primitive or assume our ancestors lacked sophistication, we might be missing the bigger picture. Second, curiosity. History isn't just found in textbooks, it's hiding in family recipe boxes, in the fading ink of great-grandma's dessert notes, in the street food stalls preserving techniques that predate empires. And finally, connection. That medieval cook reaching for spices from across the globe wasn't so different from us scrolling through international recipes online. Both are acts of reaching beyond borders, of tasting the unfamiliar and making it your own. Here's the real secret. This page isn't special because it survived. It's special because it's ordinary. For every manuscript that made it to modern archives, thousands more were lost, scraped clean, burned for warmth, or simply crumbled to dust. But their legacy lingers in the flavors we still love today. That pinch of cinnamon in your morning oatmeal. It's the great-great-grandchild of a spice that crossed deserts on camelback. The slow braised short ribs at your favorite bistro. They owe their technique to some nameless medieval cook who first sealed a clay pot with dough. The past isn't dead. It's on your plate, so the next time you take a bite of something extraordinary, whether it's a truffle-infused delicacy or just perfectly buttered toast, pause for a second. You're not just eating, you're participating in an ancient, unbroken chain of human creativity. One that stretches back to a time when someone first dared to toss a handful of foreign spices into a pot and whisper, "What if?" That's the real lesson of this fragile parchment. History isn't just something we study. It's something we taste, reinvent, and pass on, one delicious experiment at a time.